I thought I knew what falling felt like until I hit that ice outside Hannah's house last December. The ground was harder than I expected, but not nearly as hard as my daughter's voice when she looked down at me and said, "Mom, it's not that serious." I was lying there with my hips screaming and my pride shattered, watching her check her phone while I struggled to get up. That's when I realized I'd been falling for years, not from grace in my own daughter's eyes, somewhere along the way I'd become just another inconvenience in her perfectly scheduled life. But here's the thing about falling. Sometimes it's exactly what you need to remember how to stand. How did a mother who gave up everything for her child end up being treated like she was nothing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my fall started like most December mornings in Massachusetts gray, cold and full of promise I couldn't quite name. I remember standing at my kitchen window in my little apartment on Maple Street, watching the frost paint delicate patterns on the glass while my coffee grew cold in my hands. At 70, I'd learned to find beauty in the small things, maybe, because the big things had a way of disappointing you. My apartment wasn't much a one-bedroom place above Mrs. Chen's bakery, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture told a story, from the blue velvet armchair that David and I bought for our first anniversary to the oak dining table where Hannah had done her homework every night after her father died. I'd moved here 3 years ago, after Hannah convinced me that my old house was too much for someone my age. Looking back, I think she just wanted me closer so she could check off the good daughter box without actually having to drive across town. The walls were covered with photographs spanning 5 decades. Hannah's school pictures, family vacations to Cape Cod, David's military service photo, my retirement party from the library. In the center of it all hung my favorite picture, Hannah at 8 years old, a toast and grinning, sitting on my lap while I read to her. She used to curl into me like a kitten, her small fingers tracing the words as I read. "Again, Mama," she'd whisper when I finished a story. "Read it again." I twisted my wedding ring, a habit I'd never broken even 10 years after David's death. The gold had worn thin, but I couldn't bring myself to take it off. It reminded me of the woman I used to be, the wife and mother who'd believed that love was enough to sustain anything. David had been gone since Hannah was 28, killed by a heart attack at 55. Too young, everyone said. Too sudden. Too unfair. But life had taught me that fairness was a luxury most people couldn't afford. After David died, it was just Hannah and me against the world. I'd worked double shifts at the library to keep her in college, taking on extra cataloging projects and weekend hours. I'd given up my painting, sold David's tools, and put my dreams of traveling to Ireland in a box marked someday. Hannah had been my purpose, my project, my proof that something good could come from so much loss. But somewhere between her graduation and her first promotion, something shifted. The little girl who used to call me every day became the woman who sent birthday cards with pre-printed messages. The daughter who once asked my advice about everything started treating my opinions like outdated artifacts from a simpler time. I told myself it was natural. Children grew up, moved on, built their own lives. I told myself I should be proud that she was so independent. The truth was harder to swallow. Hannah had become successful, yes, but she'd also become cold. Her marketing job paid well enough for a house in the suburbs and private school for Eli, but it seemed to require her to shed every soft part of herself. She spoke in corporate jargon even at family dinners, checking her phone constantly and treating personal conversations like inefficient uses of her time. Eli was different. My 15-year-old grandson had his mother's intelligence but his grandfather's gentle heart. He'd started spending weekends with me after his parents' divorce 3 years ago. Not because Hannah made him, but because he chose to. We'd sit at my kitchen table working on his homework while I made his favorite chocolate chip cookies. He asked me about the old days, about his grandfather, about what life was like before smartphones and social media. Grandma Bella, he'd said just last month, Mom never talks about when she was a kid. What was she like? I'd paused, looking at his earnest face, trying to reconcile the loving child I'd raised with the distant woman she'd become. She was curious about everything, I'd told him. She'd ask 100 questions about every book we read. She wanted to understand how everything worked. She still asks questions, Eli had said, but now they're more like ... interrogations. That had stung because it was true. Hannah's questions weren't born from curiosity anymore. They were audits. Are you eating enough vegetables? Are you taking your medications? Are you being careful? On the stairs. She'd turned caring into a checklist, love into an obligation. My friend Sylvia insisted that Hannah still loved me, just differently. Some people show love by worrying, she'd say over our Tuesday coffee dates. Maybe that's Hannah's way. But I knew the difference between love and duty. Love felt warm, even when it worried. Duty felt cold, even when it provided. Hannah provided plenty. She'd helped me move, set up my medications in those weekly pill containers, even programmed my television remote so I could find my shows. But she did it all with the efficiency of someone checking items off a to-do list. There was no warmth in it, no joy, no connection. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 30 years sacrificing my own needs to make sure Hannah never felt unloved. And somehow I'd raised a woman who was incapable of showing love to anyone, including her own son. Eli had told me, in one of our quiet moments, that his mother had missed his last 3 school plays because of work. "It's okay, Grandma," he'd said with the resignation of a child who'd learned not to expect too much. "She's busy." That morning, as I prepared for our monthly dinner at Hannah's house, I'd felt the familiar weight of dread. These visits had become performative Hannah cooking something she'd found on tweets. If you found on Pinterest while Eli and I made conversation, and she divided her attention between us and her phone. She'd ask about my health, my apartment, my activities, with the detached interest of a doctor reviewing a chart. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. The navy dress that Hannah had complimented once. Low-heeled boots that were practical but still nice. My grandmother's pearl earrings. I wanted to look put together, competent, like someone who deserved respect rather than pity. I'd learned that Hannah responded better to strength than vulnerability. So I'd made myself as presentable and self-sufficient as possible. The drive to her house took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively more expensive. Hannah's house was a colonial with perfect landscaping and a 3-car garage. It was beautiful in the way that magazine spreads were beautiful, flawless, and somehow lifeless. Every time I visited, I wondered where my daughter had gone and who. This efficient stranger was who'd taken her place. As I pulled into her driveway that December evening, I had no idea that in a few hours, everything would change. That a patch of ice and a careless comment would finally crack open the careful politeness we'd built our relationship on. That I'd discover exactly how little I meant to the person I'd loved most in the world. But sometimes the most important moments in your life start with the most ordinary ones. Sometimes change begins not with a revelation, but with a fall. Dinner had been typical, pleasant enough on the surface, hollow underneath. Hannah served salmon with quinoa and steamed broccoli, the kind of meal that looked Instagram ready, but tasted like obligation. Keely had tried to fill the conversational gaps, telling me about his history project, while Hannah responded to emails on her phone between bites. "Grandma Bella's helping me research the 1960s, Eli had said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "She has all these cool stories about the civil rights movement and Vietnam protests." Hannah looked up briefly. "That's nice, honey. Let's make sure you're using actual sources for your bibliography, not just stories." The dismissal in her voice made my chest tighten, as if my lived experience was somehow less valid than whatever he'd find on the internet. As if the protests I'd attended, the history I'd witnessed, the changes I'd lived through were just stories with no educational value. I'd bitten my tongue, as I'd learned to do. Direct confrontation with Hannah only led to her shutting down, completely retreating behind a wall of cold politeness that was somehow worse than anger. So I'd smiled and changed the subject, asking about Eli's upcoming winter break plans. By 8 o'clock, I could feel Hannah's restlessness. She kept glancing at her watch and checking her phone, the universal signals that my presence had reached its expiration time. I'd learned to read these cues over the years to extract myself gracefully before I overstayed my welcome in my own daughter's home. I should head home, I'd said, beginning the familiar dance of departure. Thank you for dinner, sweetheart. Hannah had brightened slightly, not with affection, but with the relief of someone whose social obligation was nearly complete. Of course, Mom. Drive carefully. The temperature's supposed to drop tonight. Eli had hugged me properly, one of those fierce adolescent embraces that reminded me what real affection felt like. See you this weekend, Grandma. I'll bring my project draft. Hannah had offered her cheek for a brief kiss, already mentally moving on to whatever task waited next on her evening agenda. I'd gathered my purse and coat, made the appropriate noises about the lovely dinner and how good it was to see them both. The front door opened onto December air that bit through my wool coat immediately. I should have noticed the warning signs, though. Way the temperature had dropped since I'd arrived. The sheen on the driveway that caught the porch light, the particular stillness that comes before winter shows its teeth. But I was distracted, lost in the familiar ache of leaving Hannah's house, feeling more lonely than when I'd arrived. The walkway from her front door to the driveway curved slightly, lined with expensive landscaping that looked elegant but left shadows in all the wrong places. I'd walked this path dozens of times over the past 3 years, but never in conditions like this. The afternoon sleet had frozen into a treacherous skin of ice, invisible against the dark concrete. My first step felt normal. The second felt uncertain. By the third, I knew I was in trouble. The fall happened slowly and quickly at the same time. The way accidents do when you see them coming but can't stop them. My left foot hit the ice and simply ceased to be useful. I felt my balance shift, my body fighting gravity for a moment that felt like hours. I reached out for something to grab, a railing, a post. Anything but Hannah's minimalist landscaping offered no help. I went down hard. The impact drove the breath from my lungs and sent shockwaves through my hip and shoulder. The cold from the concrete seeped through my coat immediately, and I could feel the ice beginning to melt under my body heat. For a moment, I just lay there, stunned by the sudden transition from upright to horizontal, trying to assess what hurt and what didn't. My hip screamed in protest when I tried to shift position. My shoulder felt like I'd been hit with a baseball bat. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing embarrassment. I was 70 years old, lying on my daughter's driveway like a discarded package. Every stereotype about elderly people being fragile and helpless seemed to be manifesting in real time. I heard the front door open and Hannah's voice calling out, "Mom, are you okay?" The question sounded more annoyed than concerned, as if I'd deliberately chosen to fall to inconvenience her evening plans. I struggled to get my bearings, to push myself up into a sitting position at least. The ice made everything more difficult. Every attempt to get leverage resulted in my hands sliding uselessly across the frozen surface. Hannah's footsteps approached, the careful click of someone navigating treacherous ground while wearing inappropriate shoes. I looked up to see her silhouetted in the porch light, her face a mixture of impatience and mild concern. "What happened?" she asked, not moving to help me up. "Ice," I managed, still trying to catch my breath. I slipped on the ice. She glanced around as if noticing the weather conditions for the first time. "Oh, well, can you get up?" The question hung in the air between us. Not, "Are you hurt?" or "Let me help you." Just the practical matter of whether I could return to vertical without further disrupting her evening. I tried to push myself up, using my good arm for leverage. Pain shot through my hip, and I couldn't quite manage it. The ice was too slippery, my center of gravity too far off. I was going to need help, and we both knew it. "I think I need a hand," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. Hannah Siddan stepped closer. She extended one hand while pulling out her phone with the other, as if she couldn't spare both hands for the task of helping her 70-year-old mother off the frozen ground. "Come on," she said, her tone the same one she might use with a difficult client. "Grab my hand." I did, and she pulled with minimal effort while I struggled to find footing on the treacherous surface. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through my hip, and I couldn't help the small gasp that escaped me. "Are you hurt?" Hannah asked, but she was looking at her phone screen as she said it. "My hip," I said, trying to stay upright now that I was vertical again. "It really hurts." Hannah glanced up from her phone with the expression of someone whose patience was wearing thin. "It's probably just bruised. You should ice it when you get home." The irony of recommending ice to someone who'd just been injured by ice wasn't lost on me, but I didn't point it out. I was focused on the bigger issue, the casual way she dismissed my pain, the assumption that I was overreacting. "Maybe I should go to urgent care," I said, testing the waters. "Just to make sure nothing's broken." That got her full attention, but not in the way I'd hoped. Hannah's face shifted into the expression I'd learned to dread, the one that said I was being difficult, needy, dramatic. "Mom," she said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use with children and elderly relatives. "It's not that serious. You're walking fine. If something were broken, you wouldn't be able to stand." There it was. It's a sentence that would replay in my mind for months afterward. The casual dismissal that somehow managed to minimize both my physical pain and my emotional reality in 4 simple words. It's not that serious. I stood there in the December cold, my hip throbbing and my dignity in tatters, and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She was checking her phone again, already mentally moving past this minor disruption to her evening. In her world, I was a problem that needed solving efficiently, not a person who deserved care. "Right?" I said. Quietly. "Not that serious." I made my way carefully to my car, each step a reminder of how quickly everything could change. Hannah called out a perfunctory drive safely from the doorway, but she was already heading back inside before I'd even reached my vehicle. As I drove home, my hip protesting every bump and turn, I kept hearing those words. "It's not that serious." They echoed in my mind, gaining weight and meaning with each repetition. Because it wasn't just about the fall, was it? It was about every time my feelings had been minimized, every time my needs had been deemed inconvenient, every time I'd been made to feel like my pain, physical or emotional, wasn't worth acknowledging. By the time I reached my apartment, made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a vengeful one, but a quiet revolution that would change everything. If my pain wasn't serious to Hannah, then perhaps Hannah's problems weren't serious to me either. It was time to stop falling for someone. It wouldn't catch me. The next morning brought pain that confirmed what I'd suspected. My hip wasn't just bruised. Getting out of bed required a series of careful maneuvers that would have been comical if they hadn't been so painful. Each movement reminded me of Hannah's dismissive words, and with each reminder, my resolve hardened. I called Dr. Martinez's office first thing and managed to get an appointment for that afternoon. Then I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and my weekly pill organizer, the plastic compartments labeled with the days of the week like a countdown to mortality. Hannah had bought it for me last year, along with a detailed schedule of what to take when. "This way you won't forget," she'd said, as if I were already slipping into incompetence. Looking at it now, I saw it differently. When had I become someone who needed her medications organized by someone else? When had I stopped being trusted to manage my own health? The pills rattled in their little chambers as I picked up the organizer: blood pressure medication, vitamin D, calcium supplements. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed invalid. But somehow Hannah had made me feel like I couldn't be trusted to remember 3 simple pills. My phone rang while I was contemplating this small symbol of my diminished status. Sylvia's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with relief. If anyone would understand my frustration, it would be Sylvia. "How was dinner with the Ice Queen?" she asked without preamble. Sylvia had never been one for pleasantries, and she'd never warmed to Hannah. "She's still treating you like a inconvenient houseplant." I told her about the fall, about Hannah's reaction, about the words that had kept me awake most of the night. Sylvia listened without interrupting, one of her many gifts. "That little bitch," she said when I finished. The vehemence in her voice was oddly comforting. 70 years old and lying hurt on the ground, and she's checking her goddamn phone. "Sylvia," I said automatically, but without conviction. "No, I'm serious, Bella. This is beyond normal self-absorption. It's cruelty." I could hear her pacing on the other end of the line, a sure sign that her protective instincts were fully engaged. "What are you going to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? For years, I'd absorbed Hannah's coldness like a sponge, making excuses for her behavior and adjusting my expectations downward. Okay. But something about lying on that ice had crystallized my thinking. I wasn't asking for much, just basic human kindness from the person I'd loved most in the world. "I'm going to the doctor this afternoon," I said, "to get my hip checked." "Good. And then?" I looked around my little apartment at the life I'd built within its constraints. Hannah thought this place was suitable for me, small, manageable, requiring minimal maintenance. But I'd lived in a 4-bedroom house for 30 years before. She convinced me to downsize. I'd had gardens and space for painting and room for all my books. I'd given it up because Hannah thought it was too much. But maybe Hannah's opinion of what was appropriate for me wasn't the final word. "I don't know yet," I told Sylvia. "But I'm done apologizing for taking up space in her life." After we hung up, I called Eli. He answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and young in a way. That reminded me that not everyone in Hannah's family had lost their capacity for warmth. "Grandma Bella, how are you? Mom said you fell last night." "Are you okay?" The concern in his voice was so different from his mother's reaction that it almost brought tears to my eyes. Here was a 15-year-old boy showing more empathy than his grown mother had managed. "I'm fine, sweetie. It's just a little banged up. How are you?" We talked for 20 minutes about his classes, his friends, his plans for winter break. He told me about a girl he liked, about a disagreement with his mother over his choice of electives for next semester, about how he was thinking of applying for a summer program in environmental science. "Mom thinks it's a waste of time," he said. "She wants me to do something more practical like business or finance." I thought about the 8-year-old Hannah who had wanted to know how everything worked, who had been fascinated by every living thing she encountered. Where had that curiosity gone? When had she decided that wonder was impractical? "What do you think?" I asked Eli. "Think the planet is dying and maybe I should learn how to help fix it," he said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes emerged from teenagers. "But Mom says there's no money in environmental work." "Money isn't everything," I said, then immediately felt like a hypocrite. Hadn't I worked double shifts to pay for Hannah's education? Hadn't I sacrificed my own interests to ensure her financial security? But looking back, I wondered if I'd done her a disservice by teaching her that security was more important than passion. "I know," Eli said. "You taught me that. Remember when you showed me your old paintings in the closet? You said you gave up art because you needed to focus on practical things, but you looked so sad when you said it." I'd forgotten about that conversation, but his words brought it back. It had been during one of his weekend visits, and I'd been looking for an old photo album when he'd seen the canvases stacked in the back of my closet. Paintings I'd done in my 30s and 40s before David died and life became about survival rather than joy. "You could paint again, you know," Eli continued. "You're retired now. You have time." Time. Yes, I had time. What I didn't have was permission from Hannah, from myself. from the voice in my head that said 70-year-old women shouldn't start new projects. But maybe permission was something I could give myself. After we hung up, I found myself standing in front of my bedroom closet, pushing aside winter coats to reach the back corner where my old paintings waited in the dark. I pulled out a landscape I'd painted of the pond behind our old house. Soft blues and greens with morning light filtering through the trees. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It represented a time when I believed I had something worth creating. The doctor's appointment that afternoon confirmed what I'd suspected. X-rays showed no breaks, but significant bruising and soft tissue damage that would take weeks to heal properly. Dr. Martinez, kind woman in her 50s who had never treated me like I was fading away, prescribed physical therapy and stronger pain medication. You'll need to be careful for the next few weeks, she said. No unnecessary risks. Maybe have someone check in on you regularly. Hannah would see this as validation of her belief that I was becoming fragile, incapable of managing on my own. But I saw it differently. I saw it as a reminder that life was uncertain, that time wasn't unlimited, that waiting for permission to live the life I wanted was a luxury I could no longer afford. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I unpacked my art supplies. The watercolors had dried out. Then some of the brushes were stiff with age, but they could be replaced. What mattered was the feeling that stirred in my chest as I arranged them on my kitchen table. Anticipation. Possibility? It's the sense that I was reclaiming something essential about myself. I started with something simpler bowl of oranges from my counter, lit by the afternoon sun coming through my kitchen window. My hand was rusty, my technique uncertain, but there was joy in the movement of brush against paper. In watching color bloom and spread and become something that hadn't existed moments before. When my phone rang an hour later, I almost didn't answer. Hannah's name on the display brought back all the pain and anger from the night before, but curiosity won. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" The question sounded perfunctory, but I decided to answer honestly. My hip hurts quite a bit. I went to the doctor, and she said it's going to take several weeks to heal properly. There was a pause. "Well, do you need anything? I could pick up groceries if you can't drive, okay?" The offer was practical, efficient, and completely missed the point. What I needed wasn't grocery set, was acknowledgement that my pain mattered, that I mattered. But Hannah had never been good at reading between the lines. And I was tired of hoping she'd suddenly develop emotional intelligence. "I'm fine," I said. "I can manage." "Okay, well, call if you need anything." After she hung up, I sat there holding the phone, marveling at how two people could have the same conversation while talking about completely different things. Hannah thought she was being responsible by offering practical help. I was waiting for her to ask how I was feeling, to apologize for dismissing my pain, to show some recognition that her response the night before had been hurtful. But that conversation wasn't coming. I could wait forever for Hannah to become the daughter I needed her to be, or I could start building a life that didn't require her approval. I picked up my paintbrush and went back to work. 2 weeks passed before Hannah called again. 2 weeks during which my hips slowly healed and my perspective quietly shifted. I'd established a routine that surprised me with its richness: morning painting sessions at my kitchen table, afternoon walks around the neighborhood when the weather permitted, evening phone calls with Eli that lasted longer than they should have, but filled me with more warmth than I'd felt in months. Sylvia had been right about one thing. Once you stop waiting for someone to care about you, you have a lot more energy to care about yourself. I was mixing colors for a winter landscape when Hannah's call came, interrupting my concentration just as I'd achieved the perfect shade of gray for snow shadows. "Hi, Mom. I wanted to check on you before the weekend. How's your hip?" "Much better," I said, which was true. The constant ache had faded to occasional twinges, and I'd regained most of my mobility. "Dr. Martinez says I'm healing well." "Good. Listen, I wanted to let you know that we won't be able to do our usual Sunday dinner this week. I have a client presentation to prepare, and Eli has a friend coming over. Our usual Sunday dinner as if it were a cherished tradition rather than a monthly obligation that neither of us particularly enjoyed. I found myself oddly relieved by the cancellation. "That's fine," I said. "I have plans anyway." This was a lie, but it felt good to say. For years, I'd kept my calendar artificially clear around our dinner dates, afraid that if I wasn't available when Hannah offered, she might stop offering altogether. Now, I wondered why I'd been so afraid of that possibility. "Oh," Hannah sounded surprised, as if the idea that I might have a social life had never occurred to her. "What kind of plans?" "Sylvia and I are going to the art museum in Boston," I said, improvising. "There's a new exhibition I want to see." Another pause. "It's nice. Well, maybe we can reschedule for the following week." After she hung up, I realized I'd actually given myself a wonderful idea. I called Sylvia immediately. "Museum trip," she said. "Count me in. I'll drive if you buy lunch." That weekend's excursion turned out to be more restorative than any medicine Dr. Martinez could have prescribed. The museum was hosting an exhibition of American women artists from the 1940s and 50s, painters whose careers had been interrupted by marriage and motherhood, whose talents had been relegated to hobby status by a world that didn't take women's art seriously. Standing in front of paintings created by women my age, I felt a kinship that surprised me with its intensity. Here were artists who had painted in kitchen corners and converted basements, who had stolen time between domestic duties to create something beautiful. Women who had been told their art wasn't serious, wasn't important, wasn't worth pursuing professionally. "Look at this one," Sylvia said, stopping in front of a landscape that reminded me of my own attempts. Helen Morrison, painted in 1953. The placard says she gave up painting when her third child was born and didn't pick up a brush again until she was 68. I studied the painting-confident brushstrokes, sophisticated color relationships, a mature understanding of light and shadow. How old was she when she painted this? Sylvia leaned in to read the fine print. 72. This was part of her final series before she died. 72. Just 2 years older than I was now. I thought about the canvases hidden in my closet, about the decades of artistic silence I'd imposed on myself. Okay, what would I have painted if I'd never stopped? Okay, what might I still paint if I started taking myself seriously? On the drive home, Sylvia and I talked about paths not taken, about the price of always putting others first, about the quiet tragedy of women who disappeared into their roles as wives and mothers until they forgot they'd ever been anything else. "You know what I think?" Sylvia said as we pulled into my driveway. "I think Hannah's afraid of you." "Afraid of me?" I laughed. "I'm her 70-year-old mother. What could she possibly be afraid of? She's afraid of what you represent. All the choices. She's made all the parts of herself she's had to suppress to be successful in her career. You're living proof that there are other ways to live." I pondered this as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. Was it possible that Hannah's coldness wasn't indifference but fear? Fear that if she let herself feel too much, care too much, she'd lose the hard-won armor that protected her in the corporate world. That evening, while sorting through papers in my desk drawer, I found an old photo album I'd forgotten about. It was one of those magnetic page albums from the 1980s, filled with pictures from Hannah's teenage years. I settled into my armchair with a cup of tea and opened it carefully. The plastic pages crackling with age. The first photo stopped me cold. Hannah at 16, paint-covered and grinning, standing in front of an easel in our old kitchen. She'd been taking an art class at school and had convinced me to let her set up a painting station at home. For months, she'd painted every afternoon, filling canvas after canvas with bold, confident strokes. She'd been really good with an intuitive understanding of color and composition that had impressed even her teacher. I turned the page. Hannah at her high school art show, standing proudly next to a painting that had won second place in the regional competition. She'd been so excited that night, talking animatedly about art school applications and her plans to major in fine arts. But then David had died, and practical concerns had taken precedence. Hannah had switched her major to business, traded her easel for a laptop, channeled her creativity into marketing campaigns instead of personal expression. I'd supported the change, encouraged it, even because I'd wanted her to have financial security, the kind of stability that David and I had never quite achieved. Looking at these photos now, I saw what we'd both lost. Hannah had gained professional success, but sacrificed the part of herself that had found joy in creation. And I'd gained the satisfaction of knowing my daughter was financially secure but lost the vibrant, passionate young woman who had once filled our house with laughter and paint fumes. Page after page revealed a daughter. I'd forgotten Hannah helping me plant vegetables in our garden, Hannah reading to children at the library's summer program, Hannah curled up with a book and a cup of hot chocolate, completely absorbed in whatever story had captured her imagination. When had she stopped reading for pleasure? When had she stopped gardening? When had she become someone who saw beauty as frivolous and creativity as a luxury she couldn't afford? I found myself crying not just for my lost relationship with Hannah, but for the loss of who she'd been. The woman who had dismissed my pain on her icy driveway was a stranger to the girl in these photos. Somewhere along the way, life had hardened her into someone I barely recognized. But the photos also reminded me of something else. I had been different too. The woman in these pictures was confident, involved, creative. She had opinions and interests and a life beyond her role as Hannah's mother. She had painted watercolors and volunteered at the library and hosted dinner parties where friends lingered long into the evening discussing books and politics and art. When had I stopped being that woman? When had I shrunk myself down to fit into the narrow space Hannah had allocated for a mother in her life? My phone buzzed with a text from Eli. "Hey, Grandma, can I come over Saturday? Mom's working all weekend and I'm bored." I looked around my little apartment with fresh eyes. It was small, yes, but it could accommodate more than just my quiet existence. I had a pull-out couch where Eli could sleep, a kitchen where we could cook together, art supplies we could share. I had stories to tell and skills to teach and love to give to someone who actually wanted to receive it. I texted back, "Of course. Want to help me with a painting project?" His response was immediate. "Yes. Can we paint something Mom would hate?" Laughed out loud, surprising myself with the sound. When was the last time I'd laughed like that? When was the last time anyone had wanted to spend time with me, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection? I closed the photo album and put it away. But not before tearing out one picture Hannah at 16, paint-covered and radiant with possibility. I propped it on my easel next to my current painting. Not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder that people could change, could find their way back to themselves, could remember who they'd been before life taught them to be smaller. Maybe Hannah would never become that girl again. Maybe our relationship was too damaged to repair. But I could become the woman in those photos, again the one who had interests and passions and a life worth living. I could stop waiting for my daughter's permission to take up space in the world. I could start with painting. The rest would follow. 3 weeks after the museum trip, Eli came to spend the weekend as planned. I'd prepared for his visit like I was hosting royalty, stocked the refrigerator with his favorite foods, cleared space on my kitchen table for our joint art project, and checked out several books from the library about environmental science. His latest passion, when he arrived on Saturday morning, dropped off by his father rather than Hannah. He was carrying a large box that seemed too heavy for his 15-year-old frame. "What's in there?" I asked, helping him wrestle it through my door. "Books," he said, slightly out of breath. "Mom was cleaning out the attic and said I could take whatever I wanted before she donated the rest. I thought you might want to look through them first. Some of them are yours, from when you moved." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My heart clenched. I'd left behind boxes of books when I'd moved to this apartment, telling myself I was downsizing, being practical. Hannah had assured me she'd keep them safe, maybe even enjoy reading some of them herself. Apparently, they'd been gathering dust. In her attic instead, waiting for their turn at the donation pile. We carried the box to my living room and opened it carefully. The familiar smell of aged paper and old bindings rose up like incense from my past. Here were books I'd collected over decades, poetry collections, art history texts, novels that had shaped my understanding of the world. Books I'd read to Hannah when she was small, books I'd hoped she might read to her own children someday. Eli pulled out a volume of Robert Frost poetry. Its spine cracked with age and use. "This one has writing in it," he said, flipping through the pages. "Is that your handwriting?" I took the book and saw my younger self's careful annotations in the margins, notes about metaphor and meaning that I'd made when I was working on my English degree. Before marriage, before motherhood, when I believed I might become a teacher or maybe even a writer myself. "Yes," I said softly. "I used to write in my books. Your mother hated it. She said it ruined them. But I liked having conversations." With the authors in the margins, Ely grinned. "Mom would definitely hate that. She wants everything to be perfect and unmarked." He pulled out another book, a collection of Emily Dickinson. "Look, this one's full of notes too. We spent the morning going through the box like archaeologists, uncovering artifacts from my intellectual life. Art books with sticky notes marking favorite paintings. Philosophy texts with highlighted passages, novels whose characters had felt like friends. Each book held memories represented parts of myself I'd forgotten or set aside in the name of practicality near the bottom of the box. Eli found something that made him pause. "Grandma, this fell out of one of the books." He handed me an envelope yellowed with age, with "For Mom" written in Hannah's teenage handwriting. My breath caught. I recognized the envelope. It had been tucked inside a book of Maya Angelou poetry that I'd given Hannah for her 18th birthday. She'd asked to borrow it back a few months later, and I'd never thought to look inside it when she returned it. Should I read it? I asked Eli, though I wasn't sure who I was really asking. "It's addressed to you," he said gently. "She obviously wanted you to find it someday," with trembling fingers. I opened the envelope and unfolded 2 sheets of notebook paper covered in Hannah's careful script. The letter was dated just a few months before David died. "When Hannah was a senior in high school, dear Mom. I'm writing this because I don't know how to say these things out loud. And I'm afraid if I don't write them down, I'll forget to tell you someday when it matters. I know I'm difficult sometimes. I know I roll my eyes when you try to give me advice, and I know I act like I don't need you anymore. But the truth is, I'm scared about growing up. I'm scared about leaving home for college and not having you there to tell me everything's going. To be okay. All my friends complain about their moms, but I don't understand what they're complaining about. You've never made me feel stupid or small. You've always treated my dreams like they matter, even when they change every week. When I told you I wanted to be an artist, you didn't laugh or tell me it wasn't practical. You bought me an easel and turned the kitchen into my studio. I hope when I'm a mom someday, I'm half as good as you are. I hope I remember to listen the way you listen, to believe in my kids the way you believe in me. I hope I remember that love isn't just about taking care of people. It's about seeing who they really are and loving that person, okay, even when they're being impossible. I'm putting this letter in the poetry book Kay gave me because I want you to find it someday when I'm older, and probably taking you for granted. When that happens, I want you to remember that underneath whatever I've become, there's still the girl who thinks you're the best person in the world. I love you more than all the words in all the books you've ever read to me, Hannah P.S. Promise me you'll never stop painting, even when life gets complicated. Your art makes you happy in a way that nothing else does. And your happiness makes everyone around you happy too. I read the letter twice, then handed it to Eli with tears streaming down my face. He read it silently, his expression growing more serious with each line. "When did she write this?" he asked quietly. "About 6 months before your grandfather died," I said. "She was 18, getting ready to graduate from high school. So full. of plans and dreams and dot dot dot. I gestured helplessly. Love, she was so full of love. Eli set the letter down carefully. What happened to her? It was the question I'd been asking myself for years. But hearing it from him spoken with the bewilderment of someone who had never known the warm, passionate girl who'd written that letter broke something open in my chest. Life happened, I said. Your grandfather's death, college stress, career pressure, her marriage, her divorce. 1,000 small compromises that added up to someone else. But she's still in there, right? The person who wrote this letter? I looked at Eli's hopeful face and wanted desperately to say yes, but I wasn't sure anymore. How long could someone bury their authentic self before it stopped existing altogether? How many years could pass before the mask became the face? I don't know, I said honestly. But I hope so. That afternoon, while Eli worked on his environmental science project, I sat with Hannah's letter and tried to reconcile the daughter who had written it with the woman who had dismissed my pain on her icy driveway. The girl in the letter had promised to remember that love meant seeing who people really are. The woman she'd become seemed incapable of seeing me as anything more than an aging parent who required management. But the letter changed something in my understanding of our relationship. Hannah hadn't always been cold. She'd been loving, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent, which meant the capacity for those things still existed somewhere inside her, buried under years of self-protection and professional armor. The question was, what had happened to transform someone who'd once written so beautifully about love into someone who couldn't spare both hands to help her mother off the ground? And more importantly, was it too late to reach the girl who had written that letter? That evening, as Eli and I painted side by side at my kitchen table, he working on an abstract interpretation of climate change, me attempting a portrait of the oak tree outside my window, I made a decision. I was going to try one more time to reach my daughter. Not the efficient professional woman she'd become, but the loving, artistic girl she'd once been. I was going to remind her of who she used to be, of the promises she'd made to herself and to me, and if she couldn't remember if the girl who had written that letter was truly gone, then at least I would know I'd tried everything. At least I could move forward with a clear conscience, knowing I'd given our relationship every possible chance. But first, I had to figure out how to get through the walls she'd built around herself, how to reach someone who had forgotten they'd ever been vulnerable, ever been young, ever been capable of the kind of love that filled 2 pages with hope and promises. Looking at Eli's earnest face as he painted, I realized I had my answer. If I couldn't reach Hannah directly, maybe I could reach her through the one person she still loved unconditionally. Her son. It wasn't manipulation. I told myself it was archaeology. I was going to help Eli dig up the mother he'd never known. The one who had existed before fear and ambition had hardened her heart. The question was whether that mother still existed to be found. The week following Eli's visit was one of the most emotionally turbulent of my life. Hannah's letter had unlocked something in me, not just grief for our lost relationship, but a fierce determination to understand how we'd gotten so far off course. I found myself analyzing every interaction we'd had over the past few years, looking for clues about when and why she'd started treating me like a burden rather than a beloved parent. The breakthrough came when Eli called me Wednesday evening, his voice tight with frustration. "Grandma Bella, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong?" "Did my mom used to be different? Before Dad left? I mean, before she got so focused on work?" I settled into my armchair, sensing this was going to be a long conversation. What's prompted this question? I was looking through more of those books from the attic, and I found something else. A whole portfolio of paintings Mom did in high school. They single quotes incredible, like really good. But when I asked her about them tonight, she got weird and said art was just a phase she went through. My heart ached for both of them, for Eli, discovering a mother he'd never known, and for Hannah, so disconnected from her own past that she could dismiss her considerable talent as merely a phase. Your mother was an extraordinary artist, I told him. She had a natural gift that her teacher said was quite rare. She painted the way some people write poetry. It seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Then why did she stop? Question hung between us, loaded with implications. How could I explain to a 15-year-old the complex web of grief, fear, and societal pressure that had led his mother to abandon her dreams? How could I help him understand without vilifying the choices she'd made? When your grandfather died, I said carefully, everything changed. Your mother was in college studying art, but suddenly we needed her to think about practical things. Financial security, stable career prospects. I encouraged her to switch majors because I was scared of being alone, scared of not having enough money, scared that following her passion wouldn't be enough to keep her safe. You think? She resents you for that. The question caught me off guard. In all my analysis of our relationship, I'd focused on what I'd given up for Hannah. Not what she might have given up because of me. Maybe, I said quietly, maybe she does. But that doesn't give her the right to treat you the way she does now, Eli said with the moral clarity that sometimes emerges from teenagers. Even if she's angry about the past, you don't deserve to be ignored and dismissed. No, I agreed, I don't. Want to show her the paintings, Eli said suddenly. Want to remind her of who she used to be? Will you help me? Okay. This was it. Moment I'd been building toward without realizing it. It's a chance to reach Hannah through her son, to force a confrontation between the woman she'd become and the girl she'd once been. What did you have in mind? I asked. Remember how you said you used to have dinner parties where people talked about books and art and things that mattered? What if we planned something like that? Invited Mom and made it feel like the old days when she still cared about beautiful things. The idea was both brilliant and terrifying. It would require me to step out of the small, careful life I'd been living to reclaim the social confidence I'd had when I was younger. But more than that, it would require me to risk everything to potentially destroy what little relationship Hannah and I had left in the hope of recovering something better. When I asked, next weekend, Mom doesn't have any client meetings scheduled. I could tell her you want to have a family dinner to celebrate your recovery from the fall. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd use my fall the incident that had crystallized Hannah's indifference as the excuse to bring her back into my world. Okay, I said, but we do this, right? Not just dinner, but an evening that reminds her of beauty, of creativity, of the things she used to value. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. I invited Sylvia, partly because I needed her, moral support, and partly because she remembered the old Hannah and might be able to help with the intervention we were planning. I spent hours at the grocery store selecting ingredients for the kind of meal I used to make when entertaining was a regular part of my life, nothing too fancy. But everything chosen with care and attention to flavor and presentation. More importantly, I spent time arranging my apartment to showcase the parts of my life that Hannah had forgotten existed. I hung my recent paintings on the walls, displayed my books prominently, set my easel up in the living room where it couldn't be ignored. I wanted her to see that I wasn't just the diminished, dependent mother she'd created in her mind, but a full person with interests and talents and ongoing passions. Eli proved to be an excellent co-conspirator. He arrived Friday evening with Hannah's art portfolio hidden in his backpack and helped me plan the logistics of our surprise. We decided to wait until after dinner when Hannah might be more relaxed to bring out the paintings. What if she gets angry? Hey, asked as we set the table with my good china pieces I hadn't used since David died. Then she gets angry, I said. But at least she'll be feeling something genuine instead of that polite distance she usually maintains. Saturday arrived gray and cold, but I felt more energized than I had in months. This was my chance to reach the daughter I'd lost, to remind her of who she'd been before life taught her to be afraid of her own feelings. Hannah arrived precisely on time carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the expression she reserved for social obligations. She looked around my apartment with surprise, taking in the paintings on the walls and the careful attention to atmosphere. "This is nice, Mom," she said, and for a moment I heard an echo of warmth in her voice. Very ... artistic. Sylvia arrived shortly after, greeting Hannah with a kind of directness that made my daughter slightly uncomfortable but also kept her alert. "Hannah, you look just like your mother did at your age. Still breaking hearts." The comment was meant to be light, but it hit something in Hannah's expression, a flicker of vulnerability that suggested she remembered when she'd been young enough to break hearts, when she'd been passionate enough to inspire them. Dinner progressed better than I'd hoped. The food was excellent, the wine loosened everyone's tongues, and the conversation gradually moved away from safe topics like weather and worked toward more substantial ground. Sylvia told stories about her teaching days. Eli shared his environmental science project with genuine enthusiasm. And even Hannah seemed to relax slightly. It was when we were clearing the dessert plates that Eli made his move. He said, "Carefully, Grandma Bella and I found something interesting in those books from the attic." Hannah paused, a stack of plates in her hands. "Oh." Eli disappeared into the bedroom and returned with the portfolio, setting it on the cleared dining table like evidence in a trial. "Your paintings from high school? I had no idea you were so talented." The change in Hannah was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face, and she set the plates down with shaking hands. "Eli, what are you doing?" "Trying to understand my mother," he said with teenage honesty. "I'm trying to figure out when you stopped being the person who could create things like this." He opened the portfolio to reveal the first painting, a self-portrait that captured not just Hannah's teenage face, but something essential about her spirit. The girl in the painting looked directly at the viewer with eyes full of curiosity and confidence, unafraid of being seen, unafraid of taking up space in the world. Hannah stared at the painting as if she'd never seen it before. "I was just a kid," she said quietly. "I didn't know anything about the real world." "You knew about beauty," Sylvia said gently. "You knew about expressing truth through art. Those aren't small things." Eli turned to the next painting, a landscape of our old backyard garden, painted with such love and attention to detail that it made my chest ache with memory. "This is our old house, isn't it, Grandma?" "Yes," I said. "Your mother painted that the summer before your grandfather died. She spent hours out there studying the way the light changed throughout the day." "I don't want to do this," Hannah said, suddenly, her voice sharp with panic. "I don't want to talk about the past." "Why not?" Eli asked. "What's so terrible about remembering when you were happy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Hannah looked around the table at the three of us, her son, her mother's best friend, all waiting for an answer she didn't seem to have. "'Cause," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "because that girl was naive. She thought she could live on dreams and good intentions. She thought love was enough to protect the people she cared about." "And you don't believe that anymore?" I asked gently. Hannah's eyes met mine for the first time all evening, really met them. Without the usual wall of polite distance, "I can't afford to believe it, Mom. When Dad died, I learned that dreams don't pay bills or provide security. I learned that being practical isn't optionally survival." "But you're surviving," Eli said. "You're more than surviving. You're successful, so why can't you paint anymore?" Why can't you be both?" It was the question at the heart of everything, the one that had been building throughout the evening. Why? Couldn't Hannah be both the successful professional and the passionate artist? Why couldn't she be both strong and vulnerable, both practical and creative? The answer, when it came, would change everything between us. Hannah stood frozen at my dining table, staring at her teenage self-portrait as if it were evidence of a crime she'd forgotten committing. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled with 25 years of unspoken grief and buried dreams. "I can't do this," she said again, but this time her voice cracked slightly. revealing the fault lines in the armor she'd spent decades constructing. "Mom," Eli said softly, "just look at them. Look at what you used to be able to create. What I used to be able to create." Hannah's voice rose sharply. "I used to be able to create pretty pictures while someone else worried about keeping the lights on and putting food on the table. I used to be able to play with colors while my mother worked double shifts to pay for my art supplies." The words hit me like physical blows. I'd suspected that Hannah harbored resentment about the sacrifices I'd made, but hearing it spoken aloud was devastating. "Hannah, I never wanted you to feel guilty about guilty." She turned to face me fully, and I saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I felt responsible, Mom. When Dad died and I saw you working yourself to exhaustion to keep me in school, I felt responsible. So I changed my major to something practical, something that would guarantee I could take care of myself and never be a burden to anyone again." "You were never a burden," I said desperately. "You were my daughter. Taking care of you was my choice, my privilege. But don't you see?" Hannah gestured at the paintings spread across the table. "That girl who painted these beautiful things, she was selfish. She was naive. She thought the world owed her the luxury of following her dreams while other people cleaned up her messes." Sylvia spoke up from across the table, her voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "Hannah, honey, being 18 and hopeful isn't the same as being selfish, isn't it?" Hannah's composure was completely cracking now. "Look at these paintings. Look at how much time I spent on them, how much energy, how much attention. Time and energy I could have spent helping my mother learning practical skills, preparing for reality instead of living in some fantasy world where art mattered more than survival." Eli had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke with the kind of clarity that sometimes emerges from young people who haven't yet learned to complicate simple truths. "But Mom, art does matter. It matters to I can see it in your face when you look at these paintings. And it matters to the world. Why do you think museums exist? Why do people spend money on art if it's just frivolous luxury?" Hannah wiped her eyes roughly, trying to regain control. "Because some people have the privilege of caring about beauty. Some people don't have to worry about practical things, like me," asked quietly. She turned to look at me, her expression conflicted. "Mom, you've always been able to focus on beautiful things because you've never had to worry about making hard decisions. Dad handled the finances when he was alive, and after he died, you just survived. You didn't have to plan strategically or think about long-term consequences. You could paint watercolors and work at the library and live in your own little world where kindness and creativity were enough." The accusation stung because there was truth in it, but not the kind of truth Hannah thought she was revealing. I had focused on beauty, on creativity, on human connection. But it hadn't been because I was naive or privileged. It had been because those things were what made survival bearable. They were what made the double shifts and the sleepless nights and the constant worry worthwhile. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside me. "I did focus on beautiful things. But not because I didn't understand hard realities, because I understood them too well." I stood up and walked to my easel, where my latest painting sat half-finished, the winter landscape I'd been working on for weeks. When your father died, I had two choices. I could let the grief and the fear and the overwhelming responsibility consume me completely. Or I could find ways to remember why life was worth living. Art wasn't an escape from reality, was what made reality bearable. Hannah followed me to the easel, her eyes scanning the painting with an expression I couldn't quite read. "It's beautiful," she said softly. And I heard something in her voice that reminded me of the girl who used to bring me her paintings like offerings. "It's not finished," I said. "May never be finished, but working on it, trying to capture the way snow looks in afternoon sunlight, remembering that such beauty exists in the world. That's not frivolous, Hannah. That's essential." Eli had been looking through more of the portfolio while we talked, and now he pulled out a canvas that made us all stop breathing. It was larger than the others, more ambitious, and obviously unfinished. The composition showed our old kitchen, but transformed into something magical, warm light streaming through windows. Paint supplies scattered across the table like colorful confetti. A sense of creative joy that practically emanated from the canvas. "What's this one?" he asked. Hannah went very still. "I started that the week before Dad died," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was going to be a surprise for Mom's birthday. I wanted to paint our kitchen the way it felt when we were all working on art projects together, like the most wonderful place in the world." I stared at the painting, remembering that time. Hannah had been secretive about some project, disappearing into the garage for hours at a time. I'd assumed she was working on something for school. I'd had no idea. She was creating something so beautiful, so full of love for our shared life. "Why didn't you finish it?" Eli asked. "Because after Dad died, that kitchen stopped feeling magical," Hannah said. "It became just another room where Mom worked too hard and worried too much. The painting felt like a lie." "Or," Sylvia said gently, "it felt like a memory of something true that you were afraid you'd never feel again." Hannah sank into my armchair, the unfinished painting cradled in her lap like a sleeping child. For the first time in years, she looked vulnerable, uncertain. Human in a way that reminded me powerfully of the daughter I'd raised. "I miss her," she said suddenly. "I miss the girl who painted these things. I miss believing that beauty mattered, that creativity was important, that love could protect the people you cared about." "She's still there," I said, moving to kneel beside her chair. "That girl is still there, Hannah. She's just been hiding." "What if she's not?" Hannah's voice was small, frightened. "What if I've been practical for so long that I've forgotten how to be anything else? What if I've turned into someone who can only see problems instead of possibilities?" It was Eli who answered, with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from teenagers who are still close enough to childhood to remember what hope feels like. "Then you learn again. Grandma Bella started painting again at 70. You're only 42. Hannah looked at her son with an expression of surprise, as if she'd forgotten he was capable of such insight. "When did you get so smart?" "Good teacher," he said, glancing at me with a smile that filled my heart with warmth. "Actually," Hannah said slowly, "you had several good teachers. Your grandmother taught you to value beauty and creativity. Your grandfather, even though you never knew him, left behind the example of someone who lived with integrity and kindness. And I, .. She paused, looking confused. "What did I teach you?" "You taught me to be strong," Eli said immediately. "You taught me that sometimes you have to make hard choices and sacrifice things you want for things you need. You taught me that. Love means protecting the people you care about, even when it costs you something." Hannah started crying, then not the controlled tears she'd been fighting all evening, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from decades of buried grief. I wanted to comfort her, but something told me she needed to feel this completely, needed to let herself break down before she could build herself back up. "I've been so awful to you, Mom," she said through her tears. "I turned you into just another problem to manage instead of remembering that you're a person I love. I made your fall about my inconvenience instead of your pain. I've been treating you like a burden when you're actually the reason I know how to love at all. Hannah, no, let me say this. When Dad died, I was so scared of losing you two that I convinced myself the best way to protect you was to control everything about your life. But really, I was just protecting myself from having to feel vulnerable again. It was easier to treat our relationship like a business transaction than to risk caring so much that losing you would destroy me." The admission hung between us like a bridge we'd both been afraid to cross. I could see the effort it had cost her to speak such truth, could see how terrified she was of being vulnerable after years of emotional armor. "You're not going to lose me by caring about me," I said gently. "You're going to lose me by not caring about me, by turning me into a stranger." Hannah wiped her eyes and looked around the room at her paintings spread across my table, at my current artwork displayed on the walls. at Sylvia and Eli watching with expressions of love and hope. "I want to try," she said. "I want to try too. Remember how to be the person who could paint that kitchen? I want to try to be a better daughter, a better mother, a better human being." "Then start painting again," I said. "Not because you have to, not because it's practical, but because it brings you joy. Because the world needs the kind of beauty you can create." I don't know if I remember how. I stood up and walked to my supply cabinet, pulling out a small canvas and a basic set of watercolors. "Then we'll remember together." "What was it you used to say when you were little?" "Again, Mama?" "Do it again." Hannah laughed through her tears. The first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in years. "I can't believe you remember that." "I remember everything about the daughter I raised," I said. "The question is whether you're ready to remember her too." She took the canvas and paints from my hands, holding them like she was afraid they might disappear. "What should I paint?" "Whatever moves you," I said. "Whatever makes you feel like yourself again." Hannah looked around the room once more, her gaze settling on Eli's face. "Can I paint you?" she asked him. "The way I see you when you're explaining something you're passionate about? When you light up like you did tonight." Eli's smile was radiant. "I'd love that." As Hannah set up her supplies at my kitchen table, her movements tentative but growing. More confident, I felt something shift in the air around us. Not a magical transformation. Real change would take time, patience, and hard work from all of us. But a beginning, a recognition that the love between us had never actually died. It's gotten buried under years of fear and misunderstanding. Sylvia caught my eye and nodded toward the door, understanding that this was a moment for family. "I should head home," she said. "But Hannah, I hope you'll show me what you paint tonight. I'd love to see it." "I will," Hannah said, and I could hear the promise in her voice, not just to show Sylvia the painting, but to become again the kind of person who created things worth sharing. After Sylvia left, the three of us settled into the quiet rhythm of creation. Hannah worked on her portrait of Eli, while I returned to my winter landscape, and Eli sketched ideas for his environmental science project. The silence was comfortable. It's punctuated by small observations about light and color and technique. It felt like coming home to ourselves. It's like remembering a language we'd forgotten we knew how to speak. And for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future, not just my own, but ours. It's a family we'd been. It's a family we might become again. Hannah was right about one thing. The girl who had painted those beautiful things had been naive. But naivety wasn't the same as foolishness. Sometimes being naive just meant being hopeful enough to believe that love could transform everything, including the people who had forgotten how to love. Looking at my daughter bent over her canvas, her face bright with concentration and purpose, I thought maybe that naive girl had been right all along, 3 months after what Eli had dubbed the Great Art Intervention. I was sitting in my kitchen on a Saturday morning watching spring assert itself outside my window. The forsythia was blooming in Mrs. Chen's garden below, painting bright yellow brushstrokes against the gray March sky. I'd been trying to capture that particular shade of yellow in watercolor for weeks, but like most beautiful things, it insisted on remaining just slightly beyond my technical abilities. My phone buzzed with a text from Hannah, running a few minutes late. "Eli's trying to finish his painting before we come over." I smiled at the message, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. Our Saturday morning art sessions had become a cherished tradition, something all three of us looked forward to throughout the week. Hannah had rearranged her work schedule to protect those mornings, treating them with the same importance she once reserved for client presentations. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been difficult conversations, hurt feelings acknowledged, and old patterns consciously dismantled. Hannah had started therapy to address the grief and fear she'd been carrying since David's death. I'd had to learn how to express my needs directly instead of hoping she'd intuit them. Eli had played the role of patient translator between 2 generations, learning how to speak honestly to each other again. But gradually, something beautiful had emerged from all that hard work. Hannah had rediscovered her artistic voice, painting, with a maturity and emotional depth that surpassed even her teenage talent. I'd reclaimed my confidence as both an artist and a parent, no longer shrinking myself to fit into the narrow space Hannah had allocated for mothers in her busy life. And Eli had gained something precious, a family where creativity and vulnerability were valued as much as practical success. The knock on my door came precisely at 10 o'clock, followed immediately by Eli's voice calling, "We're here." Opened the door to find them both laden with supplies, Hannah carrying her easel and paint box, Eli juggling a canvas and what appeared to be several library books. "Research materials," he explained, setting the books on my kitchen table. "I'm working on a series about climate change, and I wanted to make sure I understood the science behind what I'm trying to express artistically." This was pure Elitha, kind of thoroughness that made him an excellent student and, I suspected, would make him an excellent scientist someday. But now, instead of his mother dismissing his environmental interests as impractical, she encouraged them. She'd even helped him apply for a summer internship with a local conservation group. "How's the piece coming along?" I asked, clearing space for his canvas. "See for yourself," he said, turning the painting to face me. I gasped. The image was powerful and sophisticated as stark landscape divided between lush, thriving nature on one side and dead, polluted wasteland on the other. But it wasn't the environmental message that caught my breath. It was the technical skill displayed in every brushstroke. This was the work of someone who had inherited serious artistic talent and was learning to use it with both passion and discipline. "Eli, this is extraordinary," I said. "It's the composition, the color relationships, the emotional impact. You've really found your voice." He beamed at the praise, but I noticed him glancing at his mother for her reaction. Hannah had moved to stand beside me, studying the painting with the same intensity she once brought to her own work. "It's brilliant," she said simply. "You've taken something that could be preachy or didactic and made it genuinely moving." That's the mark of real artistry, when technique serves emotion instead of the other way around. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt a familiar warmth in my chest. This was the mother I'd raised, the one who could see and nurture talent, who understood that encouraging someone's gifts was one of the highest forms of love. "I want to show you something," Hannah said, setting up her own easel. "I've been working on a project and I finally finished it last night." She unveiled her canvas with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for gallery openings. What I saw made me sit down hard in my kitchen chair. It was a family portrait, but not a traditional one. Instead of posed figures, Hannah had painted the three of us engaged in the act of creation itself. Me at my easel, working on a landscape, Eli bent over a sketchbook, and herself in the foreground, palette in hand, capturing it all. The composition drew the viewer's eye in a circle that connected all three figures, suggesting the cyclical nature of influence and inspiration within families. But it was the faces that made the painting extraordinary. Each of us was painted with loving attention to detail, but more than that, with genuine understanding of who we were as individuals. My face showed the quiet contentment I felt when painting, the sense of purpose that art had restored to my life. Eli's expression captured his earnest curiosity, his desire to understand and improve the world around him. And Hannah had painted herself with a look of joy so pure it took my breath away, the expression of someone who had remembered what it felt like to create something meaningful. "Hannah," I whispered, "it's us," she said simply. "It's who we really are when we're not trying to be who we think we should be." I stood up and moved closer to the painting, studying the techniques she'd used, the confident brushwork, the sophisticated color palette. This wasn't the work of someone tentatively rediscovering a long-lost skill. This was the work of a mature artist operating at the height of her abilities. "When did you become this good?" I asked. She smiled, the kind of smile that held years of accumulated wisdom. "I think I always was this good." I just forgot for a while that being good at something beautiful was something to be proud of instead of ashamed of. I want to hang it in the gallery, Eli said suddenly. There's a student art show next month, and they're accepting family submissions. I want people to see what real art looks like. Hannah's face went through several expressions: surprise, fear, pride, and finally determination. You know what? Yes, let's show it. Let's stop hiding our light under bushel baskets. We spent the morning painting together, each absorbed in our own projects but connected by the shared rhythm of creation. I worked on my eternal quest to capture the perfect yellow of forsythia blossoms. Eli refined details in his climate change series. Hannah started a new piece of still life of the art supplies scattered across my kitchen table, finding beauty in the tools of creativity themselves. Around noon, Hannah's phone rang. She glanced at it and made a face. "Work call?" I asked. "Klein?" "Emergency," she said, but instead of immediately answering, she looked at the phone for a long moment. Then she declined the call and sent a text message. "What did you tell them?" Eli asked. "That I'm with my family and will call them back on Monday unless someone is literally dying." It was a small gesture, but it represented a seismic shift in priorities. The old Hannah would have dropped everything for any client request, no matter how minor. This Hannah understood that some things were more important than professional availability. "Speaking of family," Hannah said, settling back at her easel, "I have something to tell you both." Her tone made us both look up with concern. "Nothing bad," she said quickly. "Something good, actually. I've been offered a position with a smaller firm. One specializes in marketing for arts organizations and cultural institutions. It would mean a significant pay cut, but it would also mean working with people who understand that creativity has value beyond profit margins. What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to take it," she said without hesitation. "I want to spend my professional time helping artists and arts organizations reach their audiences instead of helping corporations sell products that don't make anyone's life better." "Then take it," Eli said. "We don't need a huge house or expensive vacations. We need you to be happy." Hannah looked at her son with an expression of wonder. "When did you get so wise?" "Good teachers," he said, glancing between us with a grin. That afternoon, while Hannah ran errands and Eli visited friends, I sat alone in my apartment contemplating the changes of the past few months. The place felt different now, not smaller or constrained, but cozy and purposeful. My paintings covered the walls, my books filled the shelves, and art supplies occupied every available surface. It looked like the home of someone who was actively engaged with life, not someone who was merely surviving it. More importantly, I felt different. The woman who had lain on Hannah's icy driveway, dismissed and diminished, seemed like someone from another lifetime. I'd rediscovered my voice as an artist, reclaimed my identity as an independent person, and rebuilt my relationship with my daughter on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation. My phone rang, and Sylvia's name appeared on the screen. "How was Family Art Day?" she asked. "It's transformative," I said, and told her about Hannah's portrait, about Eli's environmental series, about the job offer that represented Hannah's return to her authentic values. "I'm proud of you," Sylvia said when I finished. "It would have been easier to just accept the relationship you had with Hannah, to be grateful for small kindnesses and not push for more. But you fought for something better, and you won." "All won," I corrected. "Hannah's happier now than she's been in years. Eli has a mother who's present and engaged, okay? And I have my daughter back." "The daughter you raised her to be," Sylvia pointed out. "The daughter who was always there, just buried under years of fear and social conditioning." That evening, as I prepared dinner for something I'd learned to do with care and attention rather than just survival, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman diminished by age and circumstance, grateful for whatever scraps of attention my daughter threw my way. Tonight, I was someone with a full, rich life. Someone whose relationships were based on genuine affection rather than duty. The fall on Hannah's driveway had been the catalyst. But the real change had come from my decision to stop accepting less than I deserved. By stepping back, by refusing to enable Hannah's emotional distance, I'd forced a reckoning that ultimately saved our relationship. My phone buzzed with a text from Hannah. "Thank you for today, for everything. I love you, Mom." I typed back, "I love you too, sweetheart. See you next Saturday." As I sent the message, I realized that Hannah's words, which might once have felt perfunctory, now carried real weight. She did love me, and I knew it not because she said it, but because of how she showed it. Through Saturday mornings spent in creative collaboration, through conversations that went deeper than weather and health updates, through the respect she showed for my opinions and the interest she took in my life, I'd learned something important in the months since my fall. Love wasn't something you could demand or manipulate into existence, but you could create conditions where love could flourish by refusing to accept its absence. By standing up for your own worth, you sometimes gave other people permission to remember your value. As I sat down to eat dinner with my own watercolor painting propped against the salt shaker, tonight's attempt at forsythia blossoms, which had finally captured something close to that elusive yellow eye, felt profound gratitude. Not just for the relationship I'd rebuilt with Hannah, but for the relationship I'd rebuilt with myself. At 70 years old, I'd learned to fall and get back up again. I'd learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is let someone discover what it feels like to lose you. And I'd learned that it's never too late to reclaim the parts of yourself you thought were gone forever. Outside my window, the forsythia continued to bloom, painting the world with impossible brightness. Tomorrow, I'd try again to capture that color, and whether I succeeded or not, the trying itself would be enough. The trying itself was everything in my bedroom, tucked inside my poetry book. Hannah's 18-year-old letter still waited proof that love could hibernate for decades and still wake up when the conditions were right. Proof that some promises, even when forgotten, still had the power to transform everything. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the girl who had written that letter, the girl who had promised never to take her mother for granted. She'd kept her promise after all, just not in the way any of us had expected. Sometimes love required getting lost before it could find its way home, and sometimes home was exactly where you started, seen with clearer eyes and a more grateful heart. The first spring after everything changed came softly, like a whispered apology from the earth after a long, harsh silence. Buds swelled on the magnolia outside my apartment window, and birds returned to sing morning hymns that I hadn't realized I'd missed. I spent most of April with my windows open, letting in the scent of thawed soil and the chatter of life awakening. It felt appropriate. Something had thawed in my own life too. Something long buried beneath years of polite distance and unsaid truths. Hannah and I had begun something new. Not just a fresh start, but an honest one. Every Saturday, like clockwork, she and Eli came by with paint-splattered bags and new ideas. Sometimes we painted. Sometimes we didn't. Some Saturdays were for sorting through attic boxes, others for cooking together, or just watching Eli explain his wild ideas with the fire of someone who believed in fixing the world. No agenda, no obligation, just presence, choosing each other. But healing isn't linear. Not for old bones, and certainly not for old wounds. One gray morning in early May, as I stirred biscuit dough in the kitchen, Hannah sat across from me, fiddling with a pencil and a blank sketch pad. She hadn't drawn in a week, which wasn't like her now. She usually had 3 or 4 canvases in progress at any given time. Half her attention still in the art world, even while she chatted about groceries or Eli's school. "Something on your mind?" I asked, not looking up from my bowl. She hesitated, then said, "Do you remember Dad's funeral?" The spoon paused in my hand. "Of course," I said softly. "I remember every second." "I was so angry at you back then," she said. "I didn't even understand why. You were doing everything, the arrangements, the guests, the paperwork, but I wanted you to stop. to fall apart, to scream, cry, punch something. You just held it all together. It made me feel like I wasn't allowed to fall apart either. I let the silence stretch. The flour in the air settled around us like snow. I was holding it together for you, I finally said. You were 28, Hannah. I thought if I broke, you would shatter. She shook her head. Maybe if you'd broken, I would have known it was okay to be human. Instead, I went cold. Professional, like grief, was a project to manage. It was never what I wanted, I said. But I understand now why you've built those walls. I do. Hannah looked up, her eyes misty. I'm trying to tear them down. It's harder than I thought. I reached across the table and took her hand. So we'll keep chipping away together. That day, she painted again. Not a portrait. Not a landscape, but a swirling, raw, abstract piece in dark indigos and pale golds. She didn't name it. She didn't need to, as June arrived and Eli started his internship with the conservation group. I found myself with long stretches of quiet again. Not loneliness, just space. Beautiful, welcome space. And I started something new. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center. 71, I was the oldest student, but not the slowest and certainly not the most timid. My instructor, a lively woman named Renata, had a way of coaxing out the soul behind your brush. Didn't care about skill. She cared about truth. One afternoon, she asked us to paint what you would tell your younger self without using words. I sat for an hour, staring at the blank paper. Then I dipped my brush in deep green and painted a single stem growing, from cracked earth curling upward, bearing 3 leaves, imperfect, windblown, and very much alive. No flowers, just resilience. I called it Still Growing. Renata told me to submit it to the town's summer art show. I laughed, but Hannah insisted I do it. So I did, to my astonishment. Sold. A woman bought it for her daughter who was going through a divorce. She needs to know. The mother said that broken places can still grow green things. Eli thrived in his internship. He spent July knee-deep in marshes, cataloging frog populations and designing posters about wetland conservation. One evening, after a long day out in the sun, he collapsed onto my couch and said, "Grandma, I think I finally found what I want to do with my life." "You're 15, I reminded him, amused. "I know," he said. "But this feels right. It feels like purpose." I smiled and kissed the top of his sweaty head. "Then chase it. Just don't forget to bring your paintbrush." "I won't," he said. "I want to show people why the world is worth saving. Sometimes science isn't enough. Sometimes you need beauty, too." That night, I cried in the shower. Not out of sadness, but joy. The next generation of our family wasn't just surviving. It was blooming. Late one night in August, Hannah called me. It was nearly midnight, and my first instinct was fear. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, her voice rough. "I'm just sitting here looking at Dad's old picture. And I wanted to tell someone something I've never said out loud." "Anything," I said, sitting up in bed. "I was scared he died because I made him proud." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "I used to think that once I became successful, once I didn't need you two anymore, once I had my own house and my own title, he could rest. And then he did. Forever." And a twisted part of me thought, maybe if I'd stayed small, he would have stayed. "Oh, Hannah, it doesn't make sense," she whispered. "But it shaped me, made me think love equals loss. That success costs someone else's presence." My heart ached. "You didn't make him die, sweetheart. You made him proud. Full stop. And then life did what life does, unfair things in unpredictable ways. But love never costs presence. Real love stays, even after we're gone." She cried then, quiet and long. And I stayed on the line until the silence between us was no longer heavy. That September, we hung Hannah's family portrait in the community gallery. It got written up in the local paper, not for its technique, though that was exceptional, but because it told a story, a real story about reconnection, about second chances, about generational healing. People wrote letters to the gallery. One woman said, "It made me call my mom." Another, "It gave me the courage to paint again." And one, "It reminded me that being a mother and being a whole person aren't mutually exclusive." We read those letters together, sitting in my little apartment with Eli passing us tissues, like an usher at a tearjerker movie. "I can't believe this is my painting," Hannah said. I corrected her. "It's your truth. You just finally let the world see it." As the leaves began to turn, so did the pages of our family story. One afternoon in October, got a call from a curator at the State University. They were hosting an exhibition called Second Acts, Late Life Creativity in Women Artists. And someone had submitted Still Growing on my behalf. I knew immediately it was Hannah. They wanted to display it. When I confronted her gently, with a smirk, she admitted it, with a shrug. "You're the reason I picked up a brush again. It's about time someone recognized that." Thanksgiving that year was unlike any we'd ever had. We held it at my apartment, tight, warm, filled with laughter and cranberry sauce in antique. China. Hannah made a toast. "Some of you know," she said, raising her glass, "that my mother fell last winter, and I did not handle it well." A few heads nodded. Eli rolled his eyes playfully. "But what I've learned since then," she continued, "is that sometimes a fall is just a landing you weren't ready for. And sometimes the person who falls teaches everyone else how to rise." She turned to me. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on me and for helping me remember who I am. I love you." I didn't make it through the toast without crying. And now, as I sit at my table writing this, the winter sun glinting off the icicles outside, I think back to that night I slipped on Hannah's driveway. The moment everything cracked open, she was right. It wasn't that serious. It was more than serious. It was pivotal. It was necessary. It was a fall that finally forced us to stop pretending and start repairing. That bruised hip gave way to a healed heart. That cold moment made room for so much warmth. If you're reading this and you've been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like your pain doesn't matter, I hope you remember this. You are not too old to be seen. You are not too broken to grow again. You are not too late to love or be loved in the way you deserve. Sometimes you have to fall. Sometimes they have to watch you fall. But what matters most is what you do after. And me. I painted and I stood. And now I rise. Again and again and again. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.